In this section, I will talk about pangenesis, and I will divide it in three main sections. In the first section, I will talk about what was the source of variation. That was the main question that Darwin had when he proposed his idea of evolution through natural selection, as we watched before. And every time that he proposed his idea, as he didn't know anything about inheritance, we didn't know anything about genes, everybody started asking, okay, so how variation works? And this is why he had to propose an idea that it was called the pangenesis. And he, as if you remember, he returned to previous ideas, and more than saying I am right, what he was trying to say is like we have to start thinking about this idea. So rather than say Darwin thought that he was right about this, what he was saying is let's try to think together. And actually it was a shame because he started thinking about multiple systems and started inheriting in different ways, and but he never was able to meet Mendel. And one of these ideas that he was there is the blended inheritance that we will talk more in the following class. But this idea is obsolete right now because Mendel had an idea of particular inheritance that we will talk about later. And this solved actually the problem of the inheritance in the long term. However, as I said before, although Darwin and Mendel live at the same time, Mendel was never able to communicate with Darwin. So Darwin lived without knowing that his question about the variation was solved by Mendel. So let's start talking about all these things. So let's start talking about what was the source of variation. Okay, so the first thing that we need to know to understand why Darwin proposed the idea of pangenesis is that although right now we know that in the DNA, when we have mutations, there are different phenotypic changes, and as we watch with the corn in the beginning of this course, they could be dramatic changes. Darwin didn't know that. At that time, we didn't know anything about chromosomes, and there was no idea that the chromosome and the DNA was in the nucleus. So, first thing that we have to understand Darwin is that at this time, Darwin and his contemporaries, they didn't know anything about mutations, chromosome, or genes. The only thing that Darwin knew is that when he proposed his idea of natural selection, is that there was descendants with modifications. And this is a very powerful idea. So as we watched in the previous class, for example, he saw a lot of variation here in the different organisms. So different variations in terms of color, size, spots in the different animals. So he proposed maybe some of these variations can be beneficial for the organism and they can survive. So for example, this one and this one will survive and will reproduce. However, as Darwin didn't know how the traits were passed from one generation to the other ones, there were many questions. Critics asked questions like these ones. For example, whether or not population variations could be exhausted, and if they were exhausted, if there will be only few examples of variation, as a result, the natural selection will come to a halt. So the natural selection, the evolution will stop. And Darwin was not able to answer this question. Why? Because as we said, he didn't know anything about that. So he started trying to look for these questions, for these answers. However, this is just the beginning, and generally in the beginning we made a lot of mistakes, and this is in the way that science works. You propose a hypothesis, and multiple times it could be wrong until you find the right experiment. And we're going to study that all the ways that Darwin tried to solve this question and how he started this field and how he was not successful in doing that. but it was a very important effort, and actually he, as I said before, he led all the scientific community to ask this question, and it led to this genetic revolution, these ideas of Darwin. So for that reason, as he didn't know what was the source of the variation for his idea, for his theory of evolution through natural selection, he proposed this hypothesis of the pangenesis. So one question that I might ask you in the test or in the quizzes is that a decade after Darwin published his book of the origin of the species, due to all the critics that we already talked, Darwin conceived his hypothesis of inheritance. And you might remember this schematic that I showed you when we talk about the Greek philosophers. And if you remember, there were Hippocrates proposed this idea of pangenesis, and that from every part of the body there are produced these particles, and all of them going to the semen, where they are transferred into the female, and she incubated, and this is how traits are transferred from one generation to another one. So the idea of pangenesis, that it was modeled on a concept of Hippocrates, so almost many years ago that idea was proposed, and if you remember Aristotle, he already rejected those ideas. And Darwin not only took into account the ideas of Hippocrates, he actually took ideas from different scientists of that time, and he actually modified a little bit the ideas of Hippocrates. So he took ideas from scientists like Buffon, Bonnet, Spencer, and as I said before, pangenesis. This word has two Greek origins. One that means whole, and genesis that means birth, so it's the origin of everything. And these pangenes or gemmules, they come not only from males, but they come from both, from males and from females, and from every part of the body, from any of those tissues, those gemmules, they start being produced, and they accumulate again in the semen and in the eggs of both males and females, and those both traits are passed to the next generation. So remember, the third thing that I want you to remember is that Darwin proposed the idea of gemmules or pangenes, that they were produced in different tissues of a parent, and they are incorporated into the developing egg or sperm. So they go into both the sperm and the egg, and this is how traits are passed from one generation to the next one. This hypothesis of Darwin actually helped him to try to counteract, to try to solve some of the question of his critics. So for example, it allowed it to explain things like the use and disuse. And another topic that we will talk in more detail later, that is blended inheritance, that the traits are mixed. And it allowed him to propose that the idea had particles. So it was not mixed, completely mixing, that this will create a problem from the natural selection, and we will discuss that in future lectures. So what was the positive about the pangenesis? That it will allow to Darwin to have some explanations. So explanations to the inherent change from use and disuse, and also to counteract problems like the blended inheritance. And although pangenesis, this hypothesis, allow Darwin to answer some questions, it also have several problems, although at that time nobody contradict those ideas because Darwin was so popular. So for example, if these two parents have these particles, these pangenes, and they have a kid, yeah, why the kids are not clones? If you have the same type of particles, how do you make sure that the kids will look different? Where do we find the variation? And this is just an example. The pangenesis still didn't solve all the problems. And later we will talk about the cousin of Darwin, the name is Galton, that he actually made experiments to show that the pangenesis it was not correct. However, Darwin got very upset and Galton retracted his ideas. But we will talk more about that later. So, just to finish, we're going to talk about in the following section about blended inheritance, but I want that you remember that blended inheritance is an obsolete idea. So to finish, we still have this question. We don't know how to answer it, and the important is that we don't have a mechanism. The pangenesis actually didn't give any mechanism. So a common idea, independent of the country or your political views, we know that the kids look like their parents, and for a long time, and at the time of Darwin, many scientists believe that the traits were blended, or why kids look like their parents, because the traits were blended. So you're just mixing the traits. However, here again, we don't have any mechanism. So just remember, Darwin and many contemporaries, and Darwin later changed his mind about this, assumed that these traits that were inherited were only blended. However, this didn't offer any mechanism. The mechanism came not from the blended inheritance or from the pangenesis. So this blended idea of pangenesis didn't have any mechanism. It came from a completely different idea, that it came from a monk that his name was Mendel, and we will talk in the few following classes about that. So to finish, the ideas of the blended inheritance, although the phenotypic expression, you might think that they are blended. Actually, what Mendel found is that the alleles are preserved and passed without being modified in the gametes, using the gametes. And Mendel lived, as I said before, at the same time that Darwin lives. And however, his ideas were forgotten, and they were rediscovered, and a group of scientists called the mutationists were able to rediscover his work and solve the problem, and finally offer a mechanism of why the parents look like their kids and what is the physical units of inheritance. Okay, if you have any doubt, just let me know and send me an email, and we will be in contact. Have a good day. Bye.